In this video, I will demonstrate editing the color of an image with the intention of then making a black and white image, which you need in order to make a duotone. First thing you should do is look at the composition of your photograph. And if I turn my guides on, you'll be able to see I've made a grid using the rule of thirds. And if you're looking at your image, keep in mind the rule of thirds. You don't want to have your focal point directly in the center. I think my composition is fine because it seems to revolve around the center of the photograph. And when I turn my guides off, you just command semicolon. So I feel like there's some movement in the photograph, even though it's a still photograph. When I look at the colors, I'm pretty happy with the colors. I see that there's a lot of highlights in this part of the photograph where there's some white, and you can see that there's this white halo around the leaves here. So I took this picture in the morning. The fruit was hanging down and I was looking up with my camera. So I think that results in having these quite stark white highlights. So maybe when I'm working on my color editing, I certainly don't need any more whites, but maybe I'd like to coax out some of the mid values. There's some darkness to it. I can see there's some black in the shadows of the tree, and there's some darker gray greens down at the bottom. But it predominantly has a mid-value range. So I think in that sense it's sufficiently composed and we can edit to enhance the imagery. You might want to start off by cropping the image. If you want to get rid of an element that you don't want in there, I could nudge this up a bit if I wanted to. And then my fruit seems to become a little bit more dramatic. You can also work with flipping. Sometimes, depending on your subject matter and the composition, you might want to go to your edit menu and go down to, I have to double click on my image layer here to get rid of my lock, and then I should be able to access my transform. And so sometimes you might want to, flip it horizontally, or not. Command Z can go back. So just look at your photograph in terms of its composition, and that's a really good place to begin. Once you've established that, I'd encourage you to go get your adjustment layers from under your window there, adjustments. And the first two rows of your adjustment layers, you should explore each one of these features because there's so much fun stuff in terms of color enhancing and color editing your imagery. Depending on what your goal is, then you might just want to do subtle enhancements, and there's just a number of tools here to work with that. The most common approach for color editing is typically to work with your levels, your curves, and maybe a little bit of the exposure or the brightness and contrast. So there's a reason those are the first four tools in your adjustments layer, because those are the most commonly used for basic color editing. Sometimes when you're getting an image ready for the web and it's a full color image, then when I look at my image size here, I have 200 resolution. I have a sufficiently good image for creating my edits. But when I convert it to a JPEG, what typically happens is the compression schemes in the JPEG reduce information. They take out color. They reduce the amount of color information. If I go from 200 dpi to 72 dpi, and I'm losing a whole lot of information. So you want to overcompensate a little bit with the contrast, or at the very end of the editing process, you want to come back and do one little extra brightness contrast, because then when you convert it to a JPEG, you're going to lose some information. So I usually just jump right into my levels. And the levels are the tools we use working with values. And this is a very important part of image editing. It doesn't matter if it's your duotone, black and white, or color. The values are always really an important aspect of editing your imagery. So there's this histogram here, and that's the first thing to look at. And you'll see that on the left side, there's this carrot with like a black outline, darker gray, and then the middle one is kind of a mid-gray, and then the one on the right is white. So that basically gives us information as to the values in our photograph. You'll see on the right side with the white carrot, there's a line that juts up. And as you can see, that corresponds with, there's some extreme white. There's not a whole lot of it, but there's some extreme highlights. And that corresponds with these highlights that exist up here in the top part on the fruit and on the leaf. Then it drops, and we have some kind of modest low grays. And then as we move to the left and we get to the middle kind of carrot here that has the mid grays, you can see that there's a little bit more information. So somewhere between just before the mid grays and moving into the dark grays, we have the bulk of our spread of our color or our values information. And then it tapers down. And when you get to the far left, you can see that there's not that many super dark values. And when I look at my imagery, that's true. I don't have a lot of, it's not a very dark imagery. Most of the information, the value information, is in this part of the photograph. So this histogram basically interprets the value spread on your photograph, and that is a really important thing for you to look at. You can usually make subtle adjustments just by moving the carrots, and you can see how the darkness is starting to creep in. If I work with the mid grays and I move to the right, I'm actually getting more white, and when I move to the left, I'm getting more darks. You can just go to the left with the white. I'm just going to discard that because I want to go back and do that again. So that was the first thing, working with the carrots. There's also a universal adjustment here at the bottom part where you get your gradient grayscale. And this is a more heavy-handed approach. And it's kind of crude, you know, I either get darker range when I move my white carrot to the left, or I get a lighter range when I do that. There's not a whole lot of room for finessing, it's just more extreme. The third way you can adjust your levels is working with these eyedrop tools. And this is a really fun way to work. You've got, of course, your eyedrop tool in the bottom has a white tip, and the center one has a gray tip, and the top one has a black tip. So if I'm looking to enhance my mid grays, or I want to coax out a little bit more detail, I have a lot of detail in my imagery. Look at the texture on the leaves. Even though some of them are bleached out, there's still a lot of texture there. So I think I'm not so worried about the lights. I have enough lights here. And I think I still need some darker and mid grays, maybe some lighter grays, somewhere maybe in here or on the other side. So I'm going to experiment with my eyedrop tool with the mid and the dark grays. So what you do is essentially pick one. Let's pick the black one first. And you go over and you're essentially looking for the areas of your photograph that have dark areas. So if I look down at the bottom, I've got some greens that are almost black at the very bottom. I've got some dark shadows in a couple of places. So you're essentially kind of looking for those areas, and then you just click on one and you can see the adjustment. I'm going to just back off that, and I'm going to just experiment with looking for the dark areas. As you can see, it really darkens it up a lot, and I'm not so sure that's exactly what I want. I don't want it to become too dark. That's not a bad adjustment. Now look too, when you're making these adjustments, look how your histogram changes. See now how I have a lot more darker information on my histogram, right? There's my original histogram. And then when I put a little darkness on there, let me just pick another one, then you can see the spread of information extends along the dark value area. So, but it might be a little too extreme. I'm going to try working with the mid-gray. So I select the mid-gray eyedropper, and I think I'm going to be working with something like that. All right, so it's kind of trial and error, and you just need to experiment. And remember, you're trying to enhance. It's not about creating some extreme enhancement, just subtle enhancements to improve the texture and the quality of your imagery. The next thing you can work with are your curves. And the curves uses, again, you can look at the histogram. Now you should be able to understand these histograms from the white carrot on the right to the left carrot where it's black. That's the value range. And essentially the curves adjustment allows you to create these curve enhancements. And the idea is not to create, that's not a curve, right? So the idea is to create these subtle kind of adjustments that work along a curve in order to enhance your imagery. And whenever you start tweaking it, you know, sometimes you might need a little contrast, and you can kind of tweak it in and make a curve that's got a little sharp edge to it. But if I go out, it extends it, really kind of almost posterizes it. And if I go in, I can start working with those mid values. The next is you can create an exposure, which is essentially just working with lightness and darkness. The one I want to show you down here is this photo filter. And this is quite lovely. So I'm actually going to turn all of these off. Yeah, I'll turn that one off. And there's some presets here under the filter, and I think these are really quite lovely. There is the cooling filter, works with the blues and the greens. So that one I especially like. And then you've got the opportunity to work with the density, so you can kind of back off the amount of cooling, or you can increase it. And that's kind of crazy, but you can see there's some opportunity here to, if you're looking to really stylize an image, I think this layer adjustment is really a beautiful thing to work with. In fact, I like just working with that one. So I might end up going to my layers, and let's just combine maybe photo filter. I don't need that. You can pick and choose how you want to work with it. Seems like my curves was kind of washing out my imagery. I really like my photo filter. And another thing you can also do is you can work with your opacity to turn off. You reduce, you know, if I reduce my opacity, then I get that. And if I increase it gradually, I can kind of coax out some of those cooler colors that I think are quite pretty. So I would end up maybe working with just those two things. So I'm going to get rid of my exposure. So you remember, you can turn off your layers. Once you start editing using your adjustments, you can turn them off, and you can back off on your opacity in order to come up with an adjustment that you find pleasing.